You are about to enter a dimension not only of sight, sound, taste, or even mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. There's a signpost up ahead. Next stop, Jake Stevenson. Hi, I'm Jakey Steve, and today I'm going to be reviewing the book Altered States by Paddy Chayefsky. And no, the book is not upside down. Altered States is a very unique science fiction novel. Its setting is very confined and restricted to only a few focal locations, contrary to most other science fiction novels that I have read. There are about 4 main characters in the book, which is also a rarity when it comes to science fiction novels, at least the ones that I've read. It does create an interesting feel, though, because it allows you to bond to the main character more so, and it allows you to feel the world that the author is trying to create more so than a complex, small novel. But I still didn't get that feeling of sorrow, the feeling of getting ripped apart from the fictitious world which had become so real, never to return to it again. I just didn't get that feeling whenever I finished this book. The book was a little slow throughout and was a drag at some points, but that may just be because I'm not too familiar with the field of science that it discusses, and because of this, I give it 3 out of 5 stars. Now, before I proceed with my book review, I want to warn you that there will be a few spoilers, but they will be very limited. I won't give any major plot details or anything like that, just enough to convince you to read or not read this book. The protagonist of this novel is a university professor of abnormal psychology named Edward Jessup. One day while studying schizophrenia, he questions whether or not our other states of consciousness are as real as our waking states of consciousness. So he begins to run a few tests on sensory deprivation using isolation tanks. Then he finds this drug which allows him to question whether our other states of consciousness can solve the origin of life. It is an interesting concept, and the plot is laid out pretty well, but there's just too much dialogue and side narration. I mean, some paragraphs exceed 2 pages. That's not a problem as long as they're structured well, they're interesting, and are vital to developing the plot, a character, or the setting. But in this case, it just wasn't. And because of the small pages, the large text size, it became overwhelming many times throughout the book. And also, where there's too much dialogue, while there is too much dialogue, in some points, the narration could have been condensed if he had made it dialogue. It sounds very confusing, but put it this way, he writes too much of what the characters thought rather than what they could have easily said. I think that to write a science fiction novel, the author should at least do some research beforehand so that they can insert interesting facts and tidbits to spruce up their story. But in this book, there's just way too many technical details. And for someone who doesn't understand the topic that well or isn't interested in it, is just going to skim right over these details. But it's hard to do in this book because it's all throughout it. Now he starts off giving technical details from the first page, and it is neat at first. It creates a setting, and you realize that we're dealing with a smart dude here. But then you realize there's no end to this technical detail, and it gets a bit annoying. The author tries to even things up a bit by incorporating drama into this book, which I thought was the most interesting part. That's not good since it's supposed to be a science fiction novel. And this, unfortunately, alters the ending drastically. It makes it very heartfelt, not your typical science fiction ending. I didn't like it. Some people may, but there was some suspense and well-developed characters throughout the book, but all in all, it wasn't anything magnificent by any means. I wouldn't recommend this book to anyone unless they were actually interested in the subject of abnormal psychology, but yeah. So I'm going to conclude this book review by reading the first few pages of Altered States to give you an idea of how he writes. You might like it and you might want to read the book. and others of you might not. So, here we go. Altered States, Chapter 1, Bethesda, Maryland, 1965. The isolation tank itself was nothing more than a coffin-like bathtub made of plywood and lined with aluminum, 8 by 8 by 10 feet, and half filled with a 10% solution of magnesium sulfate and water to increase buoyancy. The water was heated to 93 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature at which a floating body feels minimal gravity. Every morning, a volunteer from Andrews Air Force Base came by, stripped and stood there while a medical student from Johns Hopkins took blood samples, and Jessup wired him up to all the EEG and EKG equipment. Heart rate, pulse, blood pressure, and galvanic skin response were tested. After this preparation, the subject climbed into the tank and floated. Jessup and his assistant placed the lid on the tank and went off to the monitoring room. Inside the tank, the volunteer subject floated in utter darkness and utter silence, effectively deprived of sensory stimulation, alone, isolated. In the beginning, it had been presumed that being entombed in a black, silent, coffin-like contraption would induce paranoia, certainly anxiety. But, on the whole, this didn't happen. In Jessup's 2 years in Bethesda, only 5 of 62 subjects showed signs of anxiety, and opened the hinge lid and asked to be dropped from the experiments. The others reported experiences ranging from pleasant to exhilarating. It seemed that depriving a man of external stimuli simply triggered a whole new set of internal stimuli. All the subjects, including those who dropped out, reported early disturbance in temporal and spatial orientation. The sense of confinement disappeared quickly, and after half an hour the subjects couldn't tell if they had been in the tank 10 minutes or 2 hours. Most of the subjects reported intense sensory excitement, especially in the area of sexual fantasy. Several even achieved orgasm. 49 of the subjects had hallucinatory experiences, and almost all reported increased clarity of mental processes, and even new patterns of thinking. That is to say, their thinking, normally linear and logical, became holistic and patterned. They saw things as a gestalt rather than in specifics. Some were able to do complicated algebra problems instantly, problems that would ordinarily have required a step-by-step solution. The most common reaction was a deep sense of rest and refreshed energy. This was supported by the electroencephalographic evidence. The first phase was marked by a distinct, repeated pattern of change. Within minutes after the activating period, well-organized alpha waves of 40 to 50 UV 11 to 12 per second appeared in all regions. After 15 minutes, there was an increase in alpha amplitude as much as 30 to 70 UV, predominantly in the frontal and central regions. At the half-hour mark, rhythmical waves of 7 to 8 per second appeared, and then suddenly, rhythmical theta trains, 6 to 7 per second, 70 to 100 UV, began to appear. This EEG pattern was startlingly similar to that of Zen priests in meditation. At any rate, on November 19, 1965, Jessup decided to take a shot at going into the tank himself. His series of experiments for NASA were over. He was writing up his findings now. The tank wasn't being used. At 11:30 a.m. on that day, he went down to the tank room, filled the tank with 3 feet of water, checked the temperature gauges, stripped off his clothes, climbed into the tank, pulled the hinge lid back over himself, lay back, and floated in the black, confined silence. At first, there were a number of physical distractions. He was fearful his head would sink, and some water got into his ears. His toes and fingers began to wrinkle. He poked about with his feet, causing ripples, hanging on in a strangely frightening way to the last bits of external sensation. He had some trouble finding a comfortable position and finally settled on folding his hands behind his head. He was conscious of the intense confinement of the walls around him, but mostly he was startled by the utter blackness. Even in the darkest room, one always expects one's eyes to adjust and to find some light, but there was absolutely no light here, nothing for his eyes to adjust to. Well, that is how Paddy Chayefsky writes. Starts off pretty good. I mean, pretty detailed, pretty interesting. But I mean, like I said, it starts to get slow during the middle. So, it's Altered States by Paddy Chayefsky. Thank you for watching a Bibliophile and LZ Productions. I'm J.K. Steve. Have a good day.